Good evening. Welcome everyone to tonight's presentation of the Hidden History of Coined Words. I'm Rebecca Roberts. I am the program curator at Planet Word. Planet Word is a brand new museum of words and language in downtown DC. We're in the historic Franklin School at 13th and K Northwest. That's it in my Zoom background. If you haven't had a chance to come visit us in person, we are open. First of all, we are open Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays from 10 to 5. Admission is free. You can reserve your pass at our website, planetwordmuseum.org. If the passes for the day you want to come have been snatched up in advance, which does happen, they're pretty popular, we do accommodate walk-ups. So bring your friends, come visit, come play with words at the historic Franklin School. If you're not here in town or not ready to visit yet, I'm so glad you're here participating in one of our virtual programs. We've been able to really build a nice program curriculum around this virtual platform. So if you are already a member and you found out about this program because you're getting our newsletter, thank you very, very much for that support. That's how we're able to keep the museum free. It's how we're able to do this kind of programming. If you found out about this program from another means, a friend sent it to you, or you saw it on a listserv or a newspaper listing somewhere and would like to know more about what Planet Word is up to, our newsletter is the best way to do that. You can subscribe at our website or follow us on social media. That's the other way you can find out what's going on. And I think that's it for housekeeping. So let me introduce you to tonight's guest. We are delighted to be joined by Ralph Keyes. He is an author of many books, most recently tonight of The Hidden History of Coined Words. You can purchase the book through our bookshop.org link. You can purchase it any way you want, but if you use our bookshop.org link, a little bit of the proceeds go to Planet Word, and that's great. Ralph Keyes, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm delighted.
You're in Portland, Oregon, is that correct?
I am in Portland, Oregon, speaking to you with a little bit of sun out for a change, mid-afternoon. It's great.
It's one of the great advantages to virtual programming is that we can reach people who are not just here in Washington. So I want to start, Ralph, with where you start in the book, and that is with Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill really played with words in a lot of ways, but tell me what is going on in this picture and why you wanted to start with Winston Churchill.
Okay, this is Winston Churchill's desk, and you can see this implement in the middle. It's sort of a paper punch. Mr. Churchill was very noise-phobic, and he hated the bang of staplers, and he banned staplers from his office. Wouldn't use one himself, wouldn't let anyone else use one, only a paper punch because it was so quiet. Then they would punch holes in paper and put these little, they called them treasury tags, pieces of yarn with bars to connect the documents. And he thought paper punch wasn't that great a word, so he invented one. He coined one. He called it a clop. This is my clop, and he expected members of his staff to call it the clop. Please bring me the clop. Well, did anyone else like that word? Not really. It died with him. But he kept on coining words. Winston Churchill was a very happy word coiner. He coined words such as bottlescape for the paintings of bottles that he liked to do. He coined fear thought for needless worrying. And my favorite, he coined Qtopia for what he thought would be the socialist society in the offing in which people stood in line a lot. They were members of
Q-U-E-U-E, Qtopia.
Utopia, the English term for lines, cues. Perfectly good words, good coinages, except nobody used them. So Churchill didn't really add that much to the language, right? Wrong. When Churchill said in 1950, "We shall parley at the summit," not meaning to add a word to the language, he did. You think about it, ever since then, we've had summit conferences, summit meetings. Anymore, we don't even need meetings or conference. We just say we're going to have a summit. Joe Biden just had a summit with Xi Jinping about the climate. I've even seen it used as a verb. So let's summit. So it's interesting how Churchill even though he tried very hard to actually coin words from whole cloth that everybody else would use, nobody used them. But they did use a word that he hadn't thought of as a contribution to the lexicon at all. Summit is probably his single most popular verbal contribution to our lexicon. And that's characteristic. Words that people very deliberately and self-consciously coin seldom become part of our language, but ones that they could just kind of throw off very often become part of the language.
Why do people consciously try to invent a word? What's the appeal?
Prestige. It used to be that coining a word was considered a very low status activity. A guy named Leon Mead wrote a book on word coinage at the turn of the 20th century. And when he contacted public figures to ask if they had coined any words, invariably they would say, no, I wouldn't dream of it.
Not me.
Yeah, not me, exactly. Even Theodore Roosevelt, he contacted Theodore Roosevelt and he said, no, I've never consciously coined a word. Well, this is the guy who gave us muckraker, hyphenated American, in the ring. Roosevelt was a great fertilizer of the language. But fast forward to today, it's a very high status activity. And the way you know that is when you see obituaries of people who have coined a word, how often it will say coined the word workaholic, coined Fred Hoyle, the British astrophysicist, coined Big Bang, even though he meant that to be an insult. And here's another illustration. Murray Gell-Mann, the physicist who won a Nobel Prize, if you go to his Wikipedia page and it says known for, and you think, well, number one would be the Nobel, right? It says known for coining the word quark, Q-U-A-R-K, for subatomic particles. That's what. So you see how prestigious it's become to coin a word. I think it's a form of immortality, just like, writing a book, coining a word. It means you'll be forever known as the coiner of a word that other people use. Not a bad form of immortality.
And, I guess we have that option because we're English speakers. This is a very fluid language and democratic in a lot of ways, right? The sources of new words and terms can really come from anywhere and have for a very
English
long
is
time.
very user-friendly. I call it open source. A lot of countries, Spain, France, Italy, have official academies that supervise the introduction of new words to the language. That they don't succeed, of course, but that's the intent. That these very learned scholars examine possible new words and approve ones for use. English has no such academy and never has, and thank goodness. We're open source. Anybody's free to add a word, and words are added constantly by everyday users, and not always intending to add a word. Let's take, for example, the word. Well, I just mentioned Big Bang. Sir Fred Hoyle, in the just after World War II, was doing commentaries on the BBC about cosmology, and he hated the idea that we were thinking the universe had been created in a cataclysmic explosion. So he wanted to blow that idea out of the water. So he said this Big Bang idea, and he kept repeating it, Big Bang, in a very sarcastic tone of voice. Well, lo and behold, they kind of like that. That sounds pretty good. Big Bang, I like that. And they began to use it. And poor Fred Hoyle, who had also coined the term C-field, C-field, for the continuous evolution of the universe, which he believed in, that one got forgotten forever. But Big Bang became his legacy. And as I said earlier, when he died in 2004, the headlines routinely said, Fred Hoyle coined Big Bang. And he knew that he was sunk. He said, words are like harpoons. Once they enter your flesh, they no longer leave.
I'm going to launch a poll here because I am curious amongst the audience here. What word do you use for those of us who love words and are devoted to wordplay and etymology. Oh, word nerds is really winning here. Let's see if anything else starts to spike. I'm partial to word nerds myself. Do you have a favorite on this list, Ralph?
I like wordies. I like the
Wordies.
simplicity of it. Yeah, wordies. I like it also because I coined it.
Tell me that story.
I was being interviewed on All Things Considered by the late, not late, the lamented long lost Robert Siegel, who I still miss. And he said, so what do you call yourself? And I hadn't even thought about it. I said, oh, just a wordie. Came out of nowhere. That's the way words get coined. They're just sort of spontaneous. You don't sit down and study Latin and Greek clauses and think about scholarly allusions. Just a wordie. So I like that.
Yeah. Well, in our poll, informally here, word nerds is winning out, but and no love for word nicks.
Oh, well, that's kind of old. That's sort of musty, isn't it? Back to the Sputnik era, and you had peaceniks and neatniks and beatniks. Beatniks was very popular at one time. Well, it still is. Beatnik, incidentally, was a coinage by the columnist Herb Caen in the San Francisco Chronicle. He just threw it off and had no expectation that anyone else would use it other than him. And it was picked up immediately. We still use it, beatnik. He didn't particularly care for it, even though he coined it. And the Beats themselves hated it. They said one delicatessen in the North Beach of San Francisco, after Herb Caen called them beatniks, said, everyone welcome here except Herb Caen.
Well, the book, and again, the book is The Hidden History of Coined Words, is full of stories of coinage, intentional, obscure, unintentional, surprising. One I want you to share with us is the Land of Oz. Where did the Land of Oz come from?
This is one of my favorite stories. Okay, so how do words get coined? You know, very careful, judicious, thoughtful, scholarly creation. Well, let's think about Oz. This is when The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was published, it immediately was a hit, the book itself, and in particular, the word Oz. We still love Oz. We still say he's like from Oz. So where did Oz come from? Well, Bohm was kind of tight-lipped about it. And so people speculated, well, maybe he got it from the land of Uz, the biblical land of Uz, where Job lived. Or maybe it was a mashup of the Uz and Oz that Bohm hoped to excite in his readers. Well, 3 years after the book was published, he finally admitted where it came from. He said he had been just wondering, where does my wizard live, as he was in the process of writing the book. And he was glancing around his office and his eye fell on a file cabinet. He had a 3-drawer file, and the last cabinet said O-Z. And he go, oh, see, Oz. I kind of like that. And so he picked it up off his file cabinet, put it into his book, and the rest is history. It's a word we all love, Oz, and it came off of a label on a file cabinet.
Had his eyes a lid on something else, or had his file cabinet been labeled differently?
Well, suppose it was a 4-drawer file.
Right.
Then the last drawer would have read U-Z. Then indeed it would have been the Wonderful Wizard of Uz, and we would have thought he had the wizard had gone to
from the Old Testament
in the land of Uz.
Right.
It's just a great illustration of how haphazard, how spontaneous, how unpredictable the coining of words actually is. And thank God it's so much more interesting, all the different sorts of ways words get coined that you wouldn't expect. They get coined to taunt, to ridicule, like Big Bang. They get coined just by accident, like Oz. They get coined as quips, wisecracks. Scientist is a word that you would think was a careful creation, a very sober creation among the people who did science. So what's its origin? Well, in 1833, members of the British Association for the Advancement of Science got together to come up with a word for themselves. They tried natural philosopher. That was a bit of a mouthful. They tried Naturforscher, the German for natural explorers. They didn't like that. Savants was kind of pretentious, and anyway, French. So then this gentleman, very sober looking guy, William Whewell, he was the master of Trinity College, Cambridge. He said, how about scientist? Well, he wasn't serious. This was facetious. This was a joke. It was like atheist or tobacconist, or there was a word in use at the time, sciolist, which referred to somebody who didn't know much but acted like he did. So everybody got a big laugh. Scientists, what a joke. And they moved along. Well, 7 years later, Mr. Whewell put scientist in a book he wrote, still not meaning it seriously, but the readers of the book kind of liked it. And so did the public in general. They picked it up, scientist, they used it, we still use it. So it still wasn't popular among his peers late in the 19th century. Sir Thomas Huxley, the eminent biologist, said he considered scientist as appealing a word as electrocution. But the public didn't agree. We like it just fine. It works fine, and scientist it is.
I was
But it was
amazed
originally
that
just a quip.
I was amazed that it is of that recent origin.
Mhm.
And that it was coined in that very deliberate way. It seems so much more organic than that.
Yes, it does, doesn't it? But that's the way words happen. Thomas Huxley himself, incidentally, did very deliberately coin the word agnostic. Now, why did he coin this word? Because he said his friends who were Christian could call themselves, Christians or believers. His friends who didn't believe at all were atheists, and he was somewhere in between. He wasn't a believer, he wasn't a non-believer. And so finally, he took the word gnostic, which was an old Greek word for believers, and he added an A and made it agnostic, and was very pleased with himself and paraded it around. Now he could say who he was agnostic. And it's a pretty good word, we still use it. When Bertrand Russell was sent to prison for opposing World War I, at his intake, the warden asked him, your religion? And he said, agnostic. And the warden goes, oh, okay, well, I guess we all believe in the same God. Russell said that the humor, he was so amused by that, it kept his spirits up for the first few months in prison.
Do you think some people have a bigger platform for inventing words than others? Is it more likely to be a successful coinage if it comes from a certain sector of society or a certain profession?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think authors do, particularly older authors, but the American Dialect Society chooses a new word every year, and they have quite a notable record of not identifying words that will last. My favorite, well, why they called Y2K. Do you remember Y2K?
Sure.
Okay, we remember Y2K. That was when the computer dates rolled over at the turn of this century. It was called Y2K. That was their word of the year. Well, nobody who knows from Y2K. But my favorite, well, they also called metrosexual, which was a very deliberate coinage. It was popular for about a year or two. I call that a pop-up word. It pops up, does some business, and then moves along, disappears. But my favorite was they called Plutoed the word of the year. Remember when Pluto was banished?
Demoted? Yeah.
Demoted, yeah, exactly. From the world of planets, from the roster of planets. Well, Pluto popped up as a word meaning to be demoted, and did a little trade. And the American Dialect Society said, well, that's our word of the year. Well, who's heard from Pluto recently? It's very, very hard to predict which words are going to make the cut and which ones will last, even
Yeah.
if they, or will they just be pop-ups and disappear? And maybe later in this conversation we can talk about new words that are being used today, and try to figure out which ones are going to last and which ones.
Well, you mentioned quark. That was something that needed to be named, right? A new discovery that needed a new name.
Yes,
And, I think a lot of those pop-up words are a name for a passing phenomenon that we
right.
need a name for in the moment, and then it outlives its usefulness.
Um,
You mentioned authors as a good source of words. I wanted to talk about WIMP and goop. I
mhm.
learned about this in your book.
Okay, so here we are. Where did WIMPs come from? Well, it came from this book, WIMPs, which was published in 1897 and became a series. The author was Evelyn Sharp, a British woman and a very adamant pacifist who served time in prison along with Bertrand Russell later on for her opposition to World War I. But in 1897, she wrote The Wimps, who were a group of kids who could dish it out but couldn't take it. They were always picking on other kids, and then they ran away weeping and crying and howling if anybody picked on them because they were wimps. Well, we changed the Y to I, and that's where wimps came from, goops. So long before, I think I figured out about 70 some years before Gwyneth Paltrow was born, this book was published, Goops and How to Be Them, by a humorist named Gillette Burgess. And this was a series of books about some very misbehaved kids. And it was sort of, they were both funny and morality tales for how kids could behave better, but and not be goops. But we like the word goops. Has a G is a good letter. Two O's are very good. And to this day, we still use goop. Don't goop on the sunscreen. That casserole was kind of goopy, wouldn't you say? So where did goop come from? Well, there's where it came from.
Well, so you touch on this idea of a word being more popular if it's sounds a certain way, if it's fun to say, if it's easy to say. Can you up your odds of a successful coinage?
Well, it's not exactly a coinage, but have we ever have it? I call it a recoinage, where you take an existing word and give it a new meaning. Have we done better than Zoom? I mean, just think about Zoom. This word, who knew from Zoom just over a year ago? And now it's like, hey, I'm sitting in my Zoom room, got my Zoom shirt on. So why don't you give me a Zoom? Can you Zoom me? Or unless you're zoomed out, life is getting kind of zoomy, isn't it? I call it the zoomification of society. Well, it goes on and on. Just think about all the ways we use the word Zoom. I think it's the most popular introduction of a new word of our time. It's at least the word of the year, probably the word of the decade, and maybe of the century as things go on.
And becomes that brand name used for the generic activity, right? Like
Right.
Google or Band-Aid or
Right.
Kleenex or Jello or yeah.
Right. But suppose Zoom had been called, let's say Mecha, MEECHA. That's a good Silicon Valley type of word, Mecha. I don't think you just can't do as much with it. And also, again, maybe we can get to this later on. Z is a great word to use. I'm sorry, a great letter to use in a coinage. And double O's are just hard to beat. Go Zoom, Google, etc. To say nothing of 007, but that's.
You mentioned in passing and in the context of the Big Bang that sometimes words are coined as an insult and take on a meaning that they didn't necessarily anticipate, or they're a play on existing words in a way that takes advantage of the moment. So I'm thinking of gerrymander, because here we are in Washington, and not only are we the political capital of the nation and therefore the source of people who know what gerrymandering is. But I will add that the person for whom the gerrymander was named is buried here in Washington at the Historic Congressional Cemetery on Capitol Hill. So we have a double connection. Tell us about gerrymander.
So, okay, this is a great example of a word that kind of came out of nowhere, was not intended to be a coinage, was not intended to last over a century as it has. The story is Governor Elbridge Gerry was the governor of Massachusetts. He was a Democratic Republican. The two words were combined at that time. And the Democratic Republicans did very artistic redrawing of congressional districts and redistricting. And the Federalists howled bloody murder, and a Federalist newspaper ran this caricature by the engraver Elkanah Tisdale of these very artistically drawn congressional districts. And because Elbridge Gerry had been the governor at the time, they called it the Gerrymander. And I say Gary because Elbridge Gerry pronounced his name with a hard G. Of course, we no longer do. It doesn't work as well as gerrymander, but it got picked, this caricature got picked up and circulated, reprinted all over the country. The word became our go-to word for crazy, artistic redistricting. And we still use it. It no longer has any inherent meaning. Who's ever heard of Elbridge Gerry? But who's ever seen this caricature? But there's no better word has presented itself. So this taunt of a word has become just a generic term for artistic redistricting. That's gerrymandering.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this sort of fits all the great criteria for coinage. It's got a great origin story. There's even an image to go with it, but also it satisfies a particular meaning. It's not just redistricting, it's irrational redistricting.
Exactly.
Overly partisan
This
redistricting.
picture captures it perfectly.
Yeah. So yes, if you want to pay tribute to Elbridge Gerry, go to Congressional Cemetery.
One of my favorite taunt words, incidentally, is guy.
G-U-Y guy?
G-U-Y guy was originated as an insult word in England after Guy Fawkes of the Gunpowder Plot, who tried to blow up Parliament, was executed in 1606. After that, a way to insult another man was to call him a guy, to associate him with Guy Fawkes. But lo and behold, a few decades later in the colonies, guy just became a standard word for a fellow, a bloke, a chap. He's a guy. And that's the way we use it today. But it continued to be insulting in England. And when G.K. Chesterton, the writer, visited the US just after World War I, and people said, hey, you're just a regular guy. He was like, huh? He didn't know whether to be insulted or complimented. It took him a while to realize that in the US, regular guy was a flattering term, not a taunting one like it would be back in the home country. But here's an interesting twist. Guy Fawkes himself, he had studied in Italy and his nickname there was Guido, and he wanted to be called Guido. Well, suppose he had been Guido Fawkes instead of Guy Fawkes. Would a generic man today be called a Guido? Would mixed groups be called Guidos? Would you go to a restaurant and would your wait person say, so you Guidos ready to order? Interesting question, and it gets to the heart of the haphazardness and the unpredictability with which words are coined and take their place in the language.
Yeah, it seems very arbitrary when you think of it that way. It could have gone another way entirely.
Exactly.
So that is an origin myth.
Bloomer was meant to be insulting. It came from the Amelia Bloomer, who wore a feminist type of garb in the mid-19th century, along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and other feminists. And there it is, the Bloomer outfit. So to insult the women who wore the Bloomer outfit, that's what it was called, or to insult the women who wore this garb, it was called the Bloomer outfit after Amelia Bloomer. Now, she didn't design it, she was not the most prominent person to wear it, but she just had a great last name, Bloomer. It just sounds funny coming out of your mouth, and it's got the B's, it's got the double O's. So suppose Amelia Bloomer had not married Dexter Bloomer. Suppose she had stayed Amelia Jenks, or retained her maiden name, which was Jenks. So would this outfit be called a Jenks outfit? Would a type of underwear today be called Jenks rather than bloomers? I don't think so. Be
No,
called
it
something.
doesn't have quite the same ring, does it?
No, it doesn't. And that's, again, it just takes us back to how unpredictable this whole word coining business is, and how much fun, much more interesting than if it was more predictable.
Yeah, right. Well, also it worked in this case. So I've written a little bit about American suffrage history, and the derision of the bloomers was enough to make a lot of that wave of women's rights advocates drop dress reform as an issue, because it was taking away credibility from things like the franchise and married women's property rights. And so a lot of them said, if they're just going to make fun of us, we're not going to take on dress reform.
Right.
So it worked.
Unfortunately, it's a shame. I kind of like that outfit.
I mean, it's a big improvement over the whalebone corset and the whole, wide skirt, and how restrictive that was, for sure.
Right.
But another word from that era is suffragette.
Mm-hmm. Another taunt word. I call these taunt terms. In 1906, a reporter for the tabloid The Daily Mail named Charles Hands, who was none too partial to feminists, wrote up a story about the radical suffragists who were, chaining themselves to fences and trying hard to get the vote for women. And so he wrote a piece in the Daily Mail saying, these are not suffragists, they're just suffragettes. And again, he thought that takes care of them. I showed them the back of my hand, didn't I? Suffragettes. Well, they like that. Suffragettes, that has a very nice sound. I like that better than suffragists. It's more forceful, suffragette. And so they just adopted it right away. They began to call their publication the Suffragette. And a century later, we still use suffragette as a very normal, non-pejorative word. There was even a movie recently. Is it plural or singular? The Suffragette.
Yeah, with Meryl Streep as Emmeline Pankhurst. It's quite a movie. I recommend it. Yeah. But that tradition is, there's certainly plenty of examples of that tradition too, of a word that is meant to be derisive, right, and the victimized group taking it on and co-opting its power and reusing it to their own purposes. That happens over and over.
Meritocracy was a word in a book title, The Rise of the Meritocracy in 1958. And the guy did not like the idea, Michael Young, the author, did not like the idea that merit could be judged by credentials rather than achievement. That Tolstoy would be dinged because he didn't ever win a Nobel Prize, or Hemingway could be taken down, could be criticized or not taken seriously because he didn't have a high school diploma. This was the meritocracy. Well, he meant it to be, an insult to the meritocracy, but sounds good to us and still sounds good, the meritocracy.
Some people are putting some of their favorite words that they're learning in the chat and in the Q&A. In fact, our founder, Ann Friedman, says she heard 2 new words today. One secondhand from me, which is voluntold.
How's that spelled?
It's a portmanteau of volunteer and told. So VOLUNTOLD. I voluntold him that he would be volunteering for the and streetery. So an eatery on the street. So both portmanteau, which is a good source of new words for sure.
I live in Streetery City. Portland is, every block has countless food carts. Streetery. I'll pass that around Portland probably.
So I think some, gerrymander or quark, we know the origin stories and they get passed around, but sometimes origin stories are wrong. And sometimes they are purposefully fictionalized. Tell us about moxie.
That's a good example. Okay, right after the Civil War, around in the early 1840s, Augustine Thompson, who was a homeopathic physician from Maine, created a patent medicine that he called moxie nerve tonic. And he said it's good for whatever ails you, for brain fever, for loss of manhood. I don't know. There was a long list. And it had some suspect chemicals in it. Eventually, he had to take out the suspect stuff and make a soft drink out of it. But and Moxie became very popular. So where did the word Moxie come from? Well, he had this origin story, Dr. Thompson, where a college classmate of his had been trekking in the Andes and had been shown an herbal healing potion by some natives, by some native healers, and brought it back, gave it to Dr. Thompson, who made Moxie nerve tonic out of it, and named it after his friend, Lieutenant Moxie from West Point. So when it became real popular and it went, they had these what they called Moxie mobiles going all over the country with somebody up in the saddle peddling Moxie, going to carnivals and fairs and athletic events. It just became super popular, and then became a generic term, Moxie. Vim and vigor. She's got Moxie. We still say that, Moxie. Well, then when he realized what a phenomenon he had, Dr. Thompson owned up. He said, well, there was no Lieutenant Moxie. Actually, I coined that word. It's my word, Moxie. Well, anybody who has lived in Maine knows it's full of Moxie coves, Moxie lakes, Moxie mountains, Moxie this, Moxie that. It was no more his coinage than than Mount Everest. Then he coined Everest for Mount Everest. But it served its purposes to have these origin stories, and I call it a coinage con, that he conned us into taking a great interest in his drink. And we liked the word Moxie, and we still use it as a generic term. Hoaxes and pranks, incidentally, are a great way to create words. Knickerbocker, for example, was the last word of a phony historian, Dietrich Knickerbocker, who wrote a hoax history of New York. It was actually written by Washington Irving, but even after it was revealed to be a hoax, people liked the last name Knickerbocker, and they began to use it for residents of New York. They're Knickerbockers. Then you had the New York Knickerbockers, became the New York Knicks. And then you had, particularly in England, knickers. They picked up on knickers and began to use that to refer to a form of underwear, and they still do. Don't get your knickers in a twist. They call plastic bags hanging from branches of trees in Ireland, those are called the witches' knickers. But it all goes back to this hoax history of New York from 1809. Written by Washington Irving, based on a faux historian named Dietrich Knickerbocker.
Well, literary characters can be a source too. I mean, milquetoast and malaprop, and those can be coinages that enter the lexicon as well.
Well, let's take milk toast. Where does that one come from? It comes from a cartoon character, Casper Milquetoast, who was an ultra shy featured gent in a series called The Timid Soul. He was Casper Milquetoast. He was afraid of his own shadow. And the series didn't last all that long. It was introduced in the mid-1920s and petered out a few years later. But the word itself didn't. The last name of Casper Milquetoast is still used as a generic term for somebody who's unusually shy and timid and kind of a weakling. He's a milquetoast. I've seen it used as an adjective, very milquetoasty. So the cartoon character didn't last, but the word did. Cartoons, incidentally, are a wonderful source of coinages. You think double whammy, bodacious, heebie-jeebies, nebbish. The list goes on of words that were originated by cartoonists and stuck around in the language long after the cartoonist died and the cartoon itself disappeared. I think it's because cartoonists, they love to play with words. And some linguists say the most important motivation in creating new words is what one of them called jubilance. the play spirit. We love to sort of play around and come up with words just for the fun of it. And often those words are the ones we like best and the ones that enter the language, sometimes losing their playful spirit, but sticking around.
We've got someone in the chat talking about we're going to get a little scatological here. We've got someone talking about the origin of the word crapper. Was it actually named after Mr. Crapper? No,
Nope.
That's a myth.
It's a hoax. There's a book called Flushed with Pride featuring Thomas Crapper, the prominent plumber who introduced the flush toilet that then was named after him, Crapper. There was a plumber named Crapper, but he did not introduce the flush toilet, and that's a hoax. The guy then later on went to publish another book, I think his name was Wallace Rayburn, about the inventor of the brassiere, whose name was Otto Titzlinger.
On the nose, yeah.
This guy was having a lot of fun, and the whole origin story of Crapper is still, I see it referenced seriously all over the place. A hoax.
Yeah. So we are here in DC, and politics is the city's business. What are some political terms? How does politics influence coinage?
Well, let's think about words that pop up. I mean, politicians are always they're always talking. That's the nature of their business. They give speeches, they're interviewed, and often they come up with words in the process, consciously or not, that turn out to be new words, and sometimes they live to regret them. Nuclear option. Trent Lott he used the term nuclear to say what he might do to blow up the filibuster and allow judges to be approved by a simple majority. Michael Crowley, the journalist, added option. It became nuclear option. And for the rest of time, Trent Lott bitterly regretted coining nuclear and the nuclear option. There are many more cases like that. Fake news, the guy who coined fake news wishes he hadn't. The guy who coined truthful hyperbole, Tony Schwartz, Donald Trump's ghostwriter, coined truthful hyperbole for his lies and now wishes he hadn't. Politics is a great place both to coin words and to regret the words you've coined. Alan Greenspan, when he was Federal Reserve Chairman, talked about the irrational exuberance that was distorting the stock market. When Terry Gross had him on Fresh Air a few years later and asked him how he felt about coining irrational exuberance, Mr. Greenspan sighed and said, I wish I hadn't. So it happens. But more seriously, let's think about decider. Now, George W. Bush once said, defending himself in a defensive sort of way, said, I'm the one who makes the decisions because I'm the decider. Well, he didn't. First of all, I don't think he realized there was no such word. It was his coinage. And then he got mocked for that uproariously. Oh, the decider, what a silly, he's the decider. Well, now we use the word, it's not a bad word. I mean, there is really no better word for somebody who makes decisions. And we talk about deciders all the time in a very serious way. There's even a website called decider.com. So yeah, politics is a great place for words to be coined. I don't know if you want to talk about it now or later in the show, all the permutations of Trump. Do you want to, so we get into
go ahead.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So I think Trump may not live on in terms of reputation, but his name is going to live. I mean, think about all the permutations of Trump, the Trumpster, Trumpian, Trump-like, the list goes on and on and on. Now, suppose, and again, here we get into, again, the haphazardness of word coining. Suppose Donald Trump was Donald Jones. Would we have Jonesian? Would we have Jones-like? Again, I don't think so. But the permutation of his name that I think will last, I don't think most of them will, but Trumpism, which we're seeing more and more, I think will last in the same sense that McCarthyism has lasted for 70 some years. Incidentally, that was first introduced by the Washington Post cartoonist Herb Bloch, introduced McCarthyism in 1951 in a cartoon. Well, now we have Trumpism, and I think long after Trump is just a bad memory, we'll talk about Trumpism as a form of hyperbole, faux populism, and heavy-handed bullying will be known as more generically as Trumpism.
Do you think MAGA will live on as an
I think
acronym
it
for Make
may.
America Great
I'm
Again?
not as sure about that as Trumpism, but I think it might. I mean, that's an interesting case where Make America Great Again is an acronym, sorry, that has become its own word, MAGA. He's just, he's a MAGA guy. He's from MAGA world, the MAGA verse. He's very, they're kind of MAGA-like. Yeah, it's become a word unto itself, and I think it will live on as a shorthand for white nationalism, MAGA. Yeah.
I think that politics is particularly fertile ground for adding prefixes or suffixes to things that reference back to something earlier,
Mm-hmm.
Contra Gate,
Right.
referencing Watergate. There are so many times when you adapt a prefix or a suffix from something
Right.
else and make a new coinage.
Well, gate is a great example of what we've been talking about today, the arbitrariness of coining. So as you said, we just have word after word after word that Iran Gate, Contra Gate, et cetera, et cetera. But now here's a question. The Democratic National Committee in 1967 rented space in the Watergate complex. And in 1972, G. Gordon Liddy and company broke in and stole records and copied records out of the National Committee's files. Now suppose, and that became the Watergate scandal, and then we took Gate and we used the word Gate as an appendage for other scandals as a suffix. But now suppose the Democratic National Committee had rented space at the Hay Adams Hotel. Where would that leave us? We wouldn't have Gate to append to all these words for scandals. We'd probably have something else, but it wouldn't be Hay Adams. You wouldn't have Contra Hay Adams or Iran Hay Adams or any other.
Yeah, but you don't know what other options have been squelched by the ubiquity of Gate.
Yes.
We only have a few minutes left, but I want to talk about whether words are passing fads or whether they have staying power. Because as we've discussed, coinages sometimes fill a need, and then when the need is gone, so are they. We actually had Ben Zimmer from the American Dialect Society on a program right around the end of 2020 to talk about the words of 2020 and what those words should be. And some of them have already faded. I have to say, in the 6 months since that conversation, we were having conversations about Blursday as the, generic day of the week. Who knows what day it is? Time has lost all meaning. We're all home all the time. Blursday.
Yeah.
I haven't heard it since.
No. I call those non-starters. At best, they're pop-ups that I referred to before. And pop-ups are very common, that a word fills a need for a while and then moves along. Mugwump actually lasted a lot longer than most. It was adapted from an Indian term, mugwump, meaning a big chief. And in the 1870s, at the 1880s, 70s, or 80s, it was used to refer to political renegades. A group had left the Republican Party and endorsed Grover Cleveland for president, and they were called mugwumps. It was not a complimentary thing to say, but it was such a great word, and it lasted for a few decades, and then disappeared. I don't know why, but we could use, I'd like to see the return of mugwumps to refer
We can start the movement right here, right now.
Yes, yes, right now.
There's
But
someone
then
in the chat.
other pop-up words didn't last nearly as long and were very dependent on given events of the day. And I'll give you a good example. There was a gentleman named Richmond Hobson, who was a naval officer who led an invasion of Cuba just before the 1898 war, and was captured and put in prison, and then finally exchanged and brought back to this country, where he made a bunch of appearances. Well, he was a very good looking dude. I have a picture of him in my book. And he was the Elvis Presley of his time. And when he was going around making appearances, it was very common for women to rush the stage and give him a big fat kiss. And that became known as Hobsonizing. When you kiss somebody out of the blue, you were Hobsonizing. Well, that had great meaning when Richmond Hobson was very famous, but who's heard of Richmond Hobson these days? So Hobsonizing was a great word in its time and a meaningless word in ours.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's still a generation that refers to a sharply dressed man as a Beau Brummel, but only if you read a lot of Victorian literature.
Right. Or take Fletcherism. There was a gentleman named Fletcher who said you should chew your food 100 times before swallowing it. And that was known as Fletcherism, because Dr. Fletcher said we ought to. And again, it was very well known in its time, but it's passed along.
Someone in the chat says a new word since the pandemic in my church. Her church is in New Jersey, which is Zurch for Zoom church.
I like that. Zurch. Is it spelled Z-U-R-C-H? Or I could tell my sister, she's been attending services by Zoom. She'll like that.
She's zurching.
Yes.
Are there words that you think do have staying power from the pandemic?
That's a really good question. I think social distance will stick around. I think flatten the curve is a very interesting illustration of what we've been talking about. But flatten the curve originated with a couple of doctors in the AIDS epidemic who were discussing how could they keep the curve from ascending and ascending and ascending of AIDS infections. And one of the doctors, they were eating Thai takeout, and he pulled the box over and he opened it up, and what was supposed to be a nice, fluffy full box was a half full box of goopy flattened noodles. And he said, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to flatten the curve. Well, that word proved very useful once this pandemic hit. We use it all the time, and I suspect we'll continue to use it. I saw a reference recently to flattening the learning curve. I think that will prove to be a useful word. Now, on the other hand, I said the other day that I thought maybe social distance would become a synonym for 6 feet. And that 2 happy birthdays would become a way to refer to 20 seconds. But I think I was wrong. I don't think that's it was fun to speculate.
Right. That's the prediction business. If no one's holding you to it, why not?
Yeah, predicting. It's a mug's game, to use an old phrase. Predict which coined words will succeed and which won't.
Sharon in the chat says she went to a Zoom Shiva a couple of weeks ago. What should we call that? Anyone want to coin a term for sitting Shiva over Zoom? Shiva?
Yeah, I mean, Z-H-I-V-A. That it's a little hard to pronounce, but
yeah,
I kind of like it. There are a lot of extraneous H's in words all over the place. So Shiva, I like that.
And Brittany says she's been trying to get amazing to take off. It's a combination of amazing and awesome when neither word fully captures the feeling.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Have you, other than wordy, which just sort of fell out of your mouth, have you ever set out to intentionally coin a term?
Oh, all the time.
Yeah.
And you failed. I have a long list of coinages that never went anywhere. I only have 2 that I can possibly point to is semi successes. The first is innies and outies. In my book, I wrote a book called Is There Life After High School a long time ago, 1976, and I referred to popular and unpopular people, or ones on the in group and ones on the outs, as innies and outies. And for a while, I began to see innies and outies used by other people talking about social crowds in high school. So that let's say, had its 15 minutes of fame. Post-truth. I wrote a book called The Post-Truth Era in 2004. And that was not a well-known phrase at the time. In fact, it was not known at all. Now, I'd love to say I coined it. In fact, I saw it in a 1990, in the late 1990s. There was an essay in The Nation called The Post-Truth Era, and I adopted it. So I didn't coin it, but I did escort it, I think, into the vernacular, the post-truth era. So those are my two semi-successes, along with dozens of failures that I won't bore you with among my own personal coinages.
Well, the future looks bright, Ralph. You can keep going. Well, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's been a pleasure spending an hour with you. It just zoomed by. The book is The Hidden History of Coined Words. It's hard to see against my virtual background there, but you can find it through our bookshop link, or really anywhere you shop for books. And thank you, all of you, for your support of Brittany says amazing presentation. Thank you all for your support of Planet Word. We look forward to seeing you in person or virtually whenever we get a chance. And Ralph, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's been a great event for me.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.